Hello and welcome to CANNAMAntv. My name is Connor MacLeod, and in this complex interview, I speak with molecular biologist Dr. Bob Melamede. Dr. Bob is a former program director and science advisor at Pheonix Tears, and former CEO and president of Cannabis Science. In this interview, we discuss the relationship between physics, the universe, and the endocannabinoid system, the functions of the CB1 and CB2 receptors in an evolutionary context, the correlation between creativity on a molecular level and creativity on a psychological level, the importance of cannabinoids for the next stage of human evolution, and factors which impede human evolutionary progress. Make sure and like and subscribe, and to support the channel further, sign up to Patreon, where you can help to build a stronger cannabis media platform. Now then, let's talk cannabis. Yeah, that is a phenomenal background. Awesome.
You can't imagine how it smells.
Yeah, no way. What is that you've got?
Yeah, my whole house smells. It's unbelievable. I had to bring him in because, in Vermont, it gets cold and damp around this time of the year, and the plants need more time.
Right.
So instead of leaving them out where they'll mold, because that started to happen already with some of them, I just figured, fuck it, I brought them all in because we had like a week of rainy, cold weather.
Yeah, nice. That is excellent. What is that you've got there? Do you know what the name is?
I have a mixture. There's a super skunk in here. There's probably a white widow. I don't, I'm disorganized.
Yeah, it's funny that very often, sometimes I hear people they just feel that there's no real differentiation. It's like cannabis is cannabis,
No. There's every one of these smells differently.
Yeah.
Very profoundly differently. Yes.
Excellent.
And for example, this one here. This one's very purple, whereas the others are green. And this one smells like hashish.
Yeah.
The others have like different kinds of sweet, delicious smells. But this one seems like it's more of a hash plant.
Excellent. Do you do any training or anything with them? Or what's your growing method? What is your method of growing? Do you do any training with them?
Well, what I do is I have them in pretty good pots. You see the size of the pots?
Down a bit.
So that lets me that lets them grow pretty decently. The tallest one there is about over 8 feet.
No, I looked over your website, and particularly the In God We Rust. I read through that and stuff like that, and that was like I think what would be best to say is just for the layman. What I've got here is, could you essentially give a breakdown of what the currently accepted mainstream interpretation of what physics is, and what the way the universe is interpreted to be, and how your perspective fits in the endocannabinoid system?
It's quite a difference, isn't it?
It's quite a difference. Quite a difference.
Well, so if we look at our conventional biomedical world, it's founded on learning the biochemical pathways and the genetics associated with them that are responsible for health and illness. That's what I got literally on my computer. I have 35,000 peer-reviewed articles that support the science that I talk about, that I've accumulated over the decades, because I'm 74 years old. And what I've been trying to do is to control and reverse aging.
That's crazy. You don't look 74, like, honestly. I just had to throw that in there.
Well, that's because I'm successful. And which then verifies the underlying scientific approach that I would like to communicate with others, because I validated it both with respect to the peer-reviewed science of the world, as well as through my personal experience and direct observation. Look at me, So what it all comes down to is all living systems require energy. That's common sense, right? We eat and we have to get rid of our waste. So the thing we should take out of that little statement really is flow, because what we're always dealing with is the flow of energy and mass that creates really time. So if we look at conventional ways of looking at things, everything is random, a fully random probability, which really intrinsically makes no sense, and I'll explain why. If you were to look at one protein, and remember, our each of our cells is made up of thousands of different proteins, and they're all interacting with one another as part of this flow concept. You know, chemicals change from one thing into another thing to create the diversity of the complexity that is us, right? So it turns out that flowing energy organizes matter, and it does that with a unique, interesting characteristic. Everything, when it flows and organizes, does it by balancing opposing forces. So in living systems, what are the opposing forces? On the one hand, there's the movement into the future that's driven by carbohydrates and amino acids. In other words, those are the fuel supplies that we build our differentiated functions on. So as a human, that means our brain, our muscles, you know, our kidneys, all of the things that are fundamentally essential to life come from our differentiated cells, cells that have used the energy flow to create special functions, like our brains, okay? And as I said, there's always a balance of opposing forces. So we have these energy sources drive us into the future, thereby essentially creating the future. But as you do that, you have to take time out to fix the problems that you create along the way. The simplest way to understand that is, imagine if you never threw out your garbage and you never flushed your toilet and you didn't have a drain in your sink and you kept living. So you bring in more and more and more, and eventually you would be living in a waste and you would not live anymore, because the complexity of the system would be towards degradation, not towards supporting your life. So what we need to do, as in an effort to become healthy, is we have to balance our movement into the future along with the waste that it creates, which includes free radicals. And then we have to balance it by recycling so that we can reconstruct from the garbage that we made and have a balance between those things. And that's what leads to health. So it turns out that what I'm really saying is that carbohydrate metabolism must be balanced with fat burning. And we see that in the popular culture today. You know, people are becoming more aware of how they can manipulate their metabolism with their diet. So we see ketogenic diets, you know, Atkins diets and paleo diets. They tend to be oriented towards reducing carbohydrates and increasing our fat burning or recycling. So on the one hand, that might sound like it's detrimental, you know, because you're reducing your movement into the future. But there's a difference between moving into the future in a way that's actually limiting your future versus moving into the future in a way that promotes your survival. And that makes, obviously, to me, a lot more sense. So the question for us here on CANNAMAntv is, how does this basics of life relate to cannabis? Why are we talking about this? And it's quite a miraculous answer. So it turns out that our CB1 receptor, the one that gets us high, has a very special role in that it's not only found on the surface of the cell, like on your neurons, but it's also found on the surface of the mitochondria, which are the energy powerhouses of your cells. That's where the bulk of efficient energy is produced. So you can think of the mitochondria as a nuclear reactor. As long as it's working good, we get a lot of good, clean energy. But if it screws up, you get Fukushima, you know, or 3 Mile Island, or what happened in the Ukraine, even bigger disasters. So we want to eliminate and minimize the consequences of those kinds of disasters. So you want to have everything in balance. And it turns out that the CB1 receptor drives us into the future, while the CB2 receptor turns on the recycling. What a miracle, you know, because in fact, our endocannabinoid system literally regulates all of our human functions. Everything that we are is regulated by the cannabis, because if you just think about it, how do we get energy for a cell? Well, we as an organism work to collaborate with our cells.
Mm-hmm.
So we eat food.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes us hungry? CB1 receptor.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, if you go on these other diets and you lose weight and you become healthier, then you've turned on enough recycling that you're able to move into the future with a more solid biochemical foundation built on harmonious flow interacting with one another to create a solid flow dependent complex future. So this idea of flow dependent really is at the basis of the miracle. So I'd like to spend a second or two describing
Please
that
do.
a little
Please
bit
do.
more.
Like I say, the less I speak, the better.
Well, if you think of your bathtub, you know, if you had a bathtub that's filled with water, you have no structure. All the molecules are randomly moving around. So there's no information. Information turns out to be equivalent with energy. It takes a lot of energy to make organization. So I'm going to divert a little bit from where I was going to give an example that I find to be very beneficial for people to give them a good understanding of what goes on. So imagine we have three versions of you. We have the live version of you. And then if we took one instant of time and we stopped time and took that pattern of all your molecules that are distributed, and we had now a second you. But this one is not flowing. This one is just a snapshot. It's just a picture of an instant of your molecular arrangement when you were alive. Because the first one, you're alive. And now we're taking that snapshot. And now we take that snapshot and we make a double of that. And now in one of those, we take all of the pieces, all of the molecules that made you up, and we mix them all around. What is the difference between those three versions of you? They're all you. What's the difference between the live one, the photograph, and the random arrangement? You see, it's only the flow that makes you alive. It's only the flow where you have to take in more organization than you require so that you can generate waste and get rid of that waste in an efficient way. Okay. So now let's go back to the bathtub. When you pull the plug on that bathtub, you have the gravitational potential, which, see, any potential can manifest itself in a flow dependent structure where there will be a balance of opposing forces, and where in biology for vertebrates, that is fundamentally regulated by the balance of CB1 and CB2.
Right.
So vertebrates are very unique because of this phenomenon. So let's go back to the bathtub. You pull the plug, and after a while, you start to form a whirlpool. Well, think of what that whirlpool is. It's zillions and zillions of molecules that are cooperating with one another to form a whirlpool. What makes them want to do that? What gives them the intelligence to do that? So what I'm trying to say really is that flowing energy organizes matter. And here in the bathtub, we can see an example of how gravity organized matter to create a whirlpool. And in the case of us, we eat food that gives us the potential to maintain the organization of us. We are flow dependent, chemically organized structures. You can go online and look up the BZ reaction, the Belozov-Zhabotinsky reaction, which was discovered back in, I think, 1955 by one of those two in Russia. And what they showed was they created kind of a artificial living flow where they had something that was reduced. See, all the food we eat is reduced, meaning it's got hydrogens that are forced on it, meaning there's energy in it. The same way as gasoline has energy in it, and then you burn it. What do you make? You make CO2 and water, right? If you burn gasoline, if you burn gas, anything that hydrocarbons you burn, if you burn them cleanly, you make CO2 and water. Well, what are we doing? We're breathing out. What are we breathing out? CO2 and water. And what are we putting in? The equivalent of gasoline, but non-toxic forms that we call food, hydrocarbons. Where we're going with this is that prior to the emergence of vertebrates, you had the chemistry that was really a pyramid of complexity built over billions of years of flow-dependent chemical complexity. But something unique happened with the evolution of vertebrates because of that CB1 receptor. And having now energy in a more efficient way that could be better used to drive us into a more complex future than could occur with the invertebrates. So let's go right back to the very beginning. We have as much time as we want, or
we do? Yeah, definitely.
We had inorganic chemicals. We didn't have life, but we had inorganic chemicals, including carbon compounds. And as they reacted with one another, because we had sunlight, the ultraviolet light hitting the planet, activating chemical reactions. We had the heat from the earth. We had volcanoes and lightning. We had energy sources that created chemical reactions out of the original simple ones. So now we started to form compounds of greater complexity, and that continued until we had sufficient levels of complexity that could allow for a kind of a positive feedback to create more complexity. So we developed these flow-dependent structures like the whirlpool in the bathtub, driven by chemical, sunlight, etc. And that eventually created in the primordial soup this whole diversity of chemical reactions that eventually were talking to one another and created such a level of complexity that you basically had cells, but without genetics. You had flow-dependent structures that were the successful, essentially, metabolism. They formed membranes. So you had a cell-like structure, but you didn't have that relationship between the metabolism that generated the organization and some kind of a record that would let you start again and work with what you've had. In other words, build over time biological evolution. So at some point, that linkage occurred between the primordial protein structures and primordial nucleic acid structures so that they were interdependent in their flow. And at some point, it became advantageous to kind of put the big suck on everything, like the whirlpool going down the drain, by taking that biochemistry and immobilizing things into large polymers, DNA, RNA, proteins, polysaccharides. Now you had the ability to go higher levels of complexity, and you created now that relationship of life, DNA related with the cytoplasm. But the key point that I want to point out here is that if you are crazy enough to believe what I just said, you'll understand that DNA is not the source of life. It's the flow that is the source of life. And DNA is nothing more than the written record of successful metabolism. This is like, when I realized this, it blew my mind because it integrated for the first time, really, religion and science.
Yeah, that's exactly
what I'm really talking about is kind of a form of creationism.
Yeah.
And God is the flow. God's everywhere, creates everything. That's the flow. So we have this interesting scientific junction now with religious thought, philosophical thought, health. Everything comes together in a very nice uniform fashion, with the irony, the ultimate irony being that at the heart of it all for vertebrates is the cannabinoid receptor, CB1 receptor, because now we develop the ability to make energy flow more efficiently. And what happened was the vertebrates are completely different than the invertebrates in their organization. But let's go back again still to the cells. Once we formed that initial cell, it was dependent on either chemistry. We had inorganic chemical feeds for sources of energy. And we had what formed the autotrophs, the cells that could live by themselves because of sunlight. Mm-hmm. And those were basically bacteria, photosynthetic bacteria, blue-green algae type things, etc., that evolved over time into another higher level of complexity. So let's look at that. Let's look at that first stage. We have the sunlight coming in. We have formed these bacteria in the soup that are now multiplying, organizing chemical structures. They're all part of the flow at now reaching a higher level. So what they're doing, though, is they're taking the reduced atmosphere. There was a lot of hydrogen and nitrogen in the atmosphere. There was no oxygen, or very low levels of oxygen. Start to create oxygen. And over 1 billion years of these bacteria making oxygen and dying, you now had generated two things. You generated oxygen and you generated a fuel supply. Because of all those dead bacteria. You know, there are these mounds, and I think there's in Australia called shirts of these piles of 4 billion-year-old life that collected there. So what we see really is a change in the flow, whereby we could use organic matter and burn it with oxygen. And that led to a new kind of a cell. Instead of a prokaryotic cell, the bacteria that didn't have a nucleus, you know, the DNA is just within that small cell. We had a joining of cells. So we had cells that were efficient at making energy, joining with other cells, forming what we call a eukaryotic cell, a cell with a true nucleus. And they have within them basically captured bacteria that turned into the powerhouse of our cells, the mitochondria. That's why they have their own DNA and their own ribosomes. You know, they were free living bacteria that became symbiotic with us. And that now powered the ability to generate more complexity out of these eukaryotic cells. So the first layer of complexity to occur was they started to form aggregates. And if you form a ball of cells and you just use your head, you know there are some on the outside and some on the inside. So they're not going to be the same. So this is the beginning of differentiation. And in the first collection of cells, they were sponges, porifera. They didn't have a high level of organization, but you saw the precursors in cells that started to specialize and form nervous cells, for example, and immune cells. Not anywhere like our immune system or our nervous system, but the primordial roots of that. And eventually, the ball of cells develops an indent. And that indent is now very specialized. It's both an ass and a mouth. So they eat and shit out of the same hole, basically, you know, at the same area of specialized cells. And as time continues to evolve and create more and more complexity, that eventually becomes a tube, a mouth and an ass. All right. And those were known as proteostomes, where they form literally head first, ass last. We, in turn, with the development of vertebrates, have a whole new plan of how to create more complexity. It's actually good because that allows for the whole development of the brain to keep happening, rather than that being the starting point of you. It's the end point of you. And that's where you now have the obligation, because what cannabis receptors have done over the evolution of time through the creation of humanity and through the creation of, it's so ironic, it's such a joke. Mammals. What's the characteristic of a mammal? mammary glands, right? Tits.
Yeah.
And what's in those tits? Mother's milk has psychoactive cannabinoids.
Yeah.
So the first thing a mammal mother does is she gives the kid some psychoactive cannabinoids. The kid gets hungry. Its brain is protected from the oxygen and the free radicals that are occurring as a result of the metabolic change. It's no longer getting oxygen through the placenta. It's got to breathe. The lungs have to develop. The brain has to develop. And if you have impairments in those processes, they lead to things like psychological problems later on. It's all part of the unfolding of the individual that we want to occur in an optimal fashion, in harmony with the creative nature of the flow of God. You don't want to ignore God. You know, you want to eat healthy, good food, breathe good air, drink clean water, and give life a chance. But instead, we have this buildup of insanity that's occurred.
Yeah.
So let's go back now to see what's happened here. When we had this transition from the proteostomes to the deuterostomes, the way embryology develops is completely different. In the proteostomes, once that you had the fertilized egg, the unfolding was predetermined. It was mechanical. So you couldn't like take a cell out and create from that one cell in the same way as you could with the more advanced organisms, where during our differentiation process, the first 8 cells that divide are totipotent. They can become anything that we are. So these are our stem cells in the highest level of variability. But as they grow and develop, they have environmental changes associated with that, just like the inside of the ball of cells versus the outside, right? It's the same thing. The communication with the environment and what is the environment evolves in the evolving fetus. And it turns out that in mammals, the CB1 receptor is the main driver of your brain's energy supply. You know, if you just think about it logically, your head is always hot, right? Why is it hot? Because it's very complex. It's got all of these connections. You know, every nerve is connected with millions, billions of other nerves. All these, it's just this incredible flow of biochemical complexity. That organization requires that you use the electron transport system, the efficient way of making energy. But that's also the dangerous way, because if you perturb the flow, you generate excess free radicals. And let me again state clearly, free radicals are chemicals with unpaired electrons, which means they want to react with anything. So your flow, if it's harmonious, is always making free radicals. And they are changing the biochemistry in a way that allows the biochemistry to self-adapt to the changing environment. So it's kind of like what happened genetically, but happening within us in our lifetime. The biochemistry has to evolve as we keep adapting, as the environment keeps changing. So where was I now?
Sorry, can I just jump in there? Do you know when you said that about the internal environmental battle, essentially, this dichotomy of exchange